grip on our economy, and that her government's failure to take cost of living crisis seriously is crushing everyday Kiwis?
Mr. Speaker, in the answer to the first part of the question, no. In answer to the second part of the question, Mr. Speaker, the impact on families is exactly why we have brought in the measures that I outlined in my primary question. We have had in mind making sure that we are particularly focused on those who are bearing the brunt of the cost of living impacts of overseas, Mr. Speaker, supply chain pressures and the war in Ukraine. Unlike the proposals posed by that party, Mr. Speaker, which we know because we've seen a live experiment of what would happen when such proposals are implemented. And, Mr. Speaker, the impact on the economy is, Mr. Speaker, very, very clear.
Oh, my goodness. How can Kiwis possibly get ahead under her government when the cost of living is continuing to rise more than twice as fast as wages?
Mr. Speaker, again, I contest what the member has claimed. Mr. Speaker, because the Stats New Zealand Quarterly Employment Survey shows that total gross earnings were up 7.9% over the past year. Mr. Speaker, I also contest that on the basis that since we have been a government, with the exception of 2022, wages have outpaced inflation. The reason I also reject the premise of the question, Mr. Speaker, is because as a government for 5 years we have focused on reducing the cost of living for New Zealanders. It has not just been during the war in Ukraine and through the supply chain constraints we've seen caused by COVID. We've increased the minimum wage. We've seen more than 100,000 families, on average, $175 a week better off. Mr. Speaker, this government finally reversed the impacts of the 1990 benefit cuts. We increased the family tax credit and accommodation supplement. We introduced the winter energy payment and Best Start payment. 1,000 more families will receive childcare assistance. We introduced free healthy lunches in schools and deliver more than 1 million of them a week. We've reduced the education costs for parents by removing the school donation policy. We've supported parents with house costs by making it for under 14s to go to the doctor. Mr. Speaker, ours has been a consistent effort across 5 years, and in contrast is not down to one policy, the national policy, tax cuts for the wealthy.
Adjusted tax thresholds. With inflation above target for 18 straight months and the government spending $1 billion a week more than when she took office, how can Kiwis have any confidence in this government's ability to manage the economy?
Mr. Speaker, because when you look at the last economic crisis that we faced, the GFC, we have not only demonstrated, Mr. Speaker, our ability to protect New Zealanders from the worst impacts of a crisis, we have done it whilst, Mr. Speaker, keeping debt lower than many other countries have, comparable to during the phase of the GFC. We have, Mr. Speaker, kept spending on track to come back to 30% relative to GDP, Mr. Speaker, all at the same time while having fewer children in poverty, 145,000 fewer in hardship than during the GFC. That is why New Zealanders can have confidence.
Does she accept that as long as her government fails to rein in inflation, interest rates on every Kiwi mortgage will continue to rise, crushing families with hundreds of dollars a week in extra interest payments?
Mr. Speaker, again, the member across the aisle clearly takes no account for what is going on globally. New Zealand is one of the few countries in the OECD where we have seen inflation peak and, yes, starting to come away. The OECD total is at 10.3%, United Kingdom at 9.9%, the United States at 8.2%, the Euro at 9.1%. But, Mr. Speaker, I should probably have already known he doesn't take into account the international news, given he's taken no reflection on what happened in the UK when they implemented a very similar program of debt-funded tax cuts.
David Seymour.
If New Zealanders' inflation and cost of living crisis is caused by overseas factors, then why is it over the last 3 months tradable inflation from overseas has fallen and non-tradable inflation here at home has just risen?
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, and yet when you factor in, for instance, non-tradable construction, 90% of that is made up by imported goods. So, Mr. Speaker, that does not, Mr. Speaker, take that, for instance, into account.
Christopher Luxon.
Why is the government proposing an agricultural emissions plan that could reduce sheep and beef farming by 20%, while increasing emissions overseas as production shifts to less efficient countries?
Mr. Speaker, 3 parts to that question. I'll answer all of them. The first reason that we are putting in place, Mr. Speaker, a program to ensure that agricultural emissions are addressed as part of our emissions profile is because, Mr. Speaker, it's the only sector currently excluded and it makes up almost half of our emissions. Mr. Speaker, we need to make sure that we do our bit to ensure that all sectors in New Zealand are addressing the contribution to climate change. The second point on the impacts on beef and lamb. The impacts on beef and lamb by the consultation that we have put out are the same as, Mr. Speaker, as what they were by the sector's proposals, He Waka Eke Noa. We recognise that we need to do some work with the sector. That's what we've asked that the consultation process is used to do. But it is disingenuous to propose that what the government has put out in consultation is different to what the sector proposed, Mr. Speaker. Thirdly, on emission leakage, I do want to answer every part because I'm genuine in wanting to see an outcome that everyone in this House can support. The third part, Mr. Speaker, on emissions leakage, the Commission itself has said that it's highly uncertain but appears that emission leakage to be low for agriculture in the near term.
What advice has she received on the number of people who will be forced to abandon New Zealand rural communities as a result of the government's plan to send production overseas?
Mr. Speaker, again, Mr. Speaker, this is where we have to make sure that we are focused equally. Once we cover all sectors that can contribute to emissions, we also look for the opportunity to lift the value of those products as a result. Mr. Speaker, the member cannot go out there and argue that we need to open more export opportunities without acknowledging that consumers are demanding sustainable products. Beef and lamb themselves undertook a survey which found that large parts of our export market, Mr. Speaker, would be willing to pay a 20% premium if they knew the products were sustainable. This is the industry's own research. We have to make sure that we're walking the talk.
Why should New Zealand farmers trust this government when for the last 5 years it's piled regulation after regulation while portraying them as villains instead of backing them as carbon efficient and most productive farmers in the world?
Mr. Speaker, unlike the member, I'm not going to ignore the fact that our food producers are at the brunt of climate change and severe weather events. Mr. Speaker, the inflation that we're just seeing, we know severe weather events have affected crops in New Zealand. It's affecting our farmers too. We cannot ignore climate change. We cannot sit by and watch our consumers go elsewhere. We can do both. And Mr. Speaker, I'm absolutely confident that in working with our primary producers, we will find a solution. I ask the member to consider being part of the solution.
Question number 2 in the name of Dr. Gaurav Sharma.
Mr. Speaker, tēnā koe, Mr. Speaker, tēnā koe te whare. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister apologise, just like she did for the dawn raids, to the Sikh community in Hamilton and across the country for the recent immigration raid at the Sikh Gurudwara in Hamilton, where Immigration New Zealand staff harassed senior citizens as well as young children for over an hour and entered the Gurudwara with shoes, without a head covering, and unveiled the sacred book, Guru Granth Sahib, despite being specifically told what the tikanga at the Gurudwara was?
Mr. Speaker, I'd say that I'm unable to give a direct answer on that without knowing in more detail what has occurred under these circumstances. Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to go away and look at what has occurred.
For the supplementary.
Dr. Sharma.
What does the Prime Minister say to the people of New Zealand and specifically to the people of Hamilton West electorate where the failed Te Pukenga Tertiary Institute is located, regarding which the Tertiary Education Commission's latest report says that its governance, its operating model and business case are high risk and low confidence?
Speaker, I reject the premise of the question.
The Honourable Michael Wood.
Can the Prime Minister confirm that Immigration New Zealand has operational independence to investigate any complaints of serious migrant exploitation and labour abuses?
Mr Speaker, absolutely, and we will defend that right vigorously.
Question number 2 in the name of Barbara Edmonds.
Whakalofa lahi atu, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Finance. What recent reports has he seen on the New Zealand economy?
Mr Speaker.
The Honourable Grant Robertson.
Mr Speaker, Statistics New Zealand today reported that the Consumer Price Index was 2.2% in the September quarter, taking the annual inflation rate to 7.2%, down from 7.3% in the previous quarter for an annual rate. This drop is not as much as economists had been predicting. High construction and housing costs and rates drove the annual figure, while quarterly numbers were affected by spikes in food and the cost of international travel. As I've said previously in this House, we recognise that this is a tough period for many households and businesses, and that is why we have provided significant targeted support and will continue to provide that to help New Zealanders weather these conditions. Inflation continues to be a global challenge, with the UK's inflation rate near 10% and projected to rise considerably higher, the US at 8.2% and Australia projected to be at 7.75% by the end of the year. New Zealand is in fact the 10th lowest in the 38-nation OECD statistics. Mr Speaker, supply constraints are easing, including the approval of more than 60,000 positions for overseas recruitment to help address workforce pressures.
Supplementary. What reports has he seen on the state of the government's books?
Mr Speaker, for the year to the end of June, the operating balance before gains and losses, the overgoal deficit, was $9.7 billion, around half of the $19 billion forecast in the budget in 2022 in May. Net debt ended the year at 17.2% of GDP, in line with budget forecasts, and this is one of the lowest levels in the OECD and well below the government's debt ceiling of 30%, ensuring we are well positioned to weather future economic shocks. Mr Speaker, New Zealand is in a strong fiscal position as we face a number of global challenges.
Supplementary. What else did the report say on the impact of the economy on government's books?
Mr Speaker, the economy performed well in the year to June 2022 due to the government's strong health response to the Delta and Omicron outbreaks. Core Crown revenue was 4.1% ahead of forecast at $117.5 billion as the strong economic recovery boosted business results, led to more people in work, which contributed to that higher tax revenue. Core Crown expenses were 0.2% below forecast as our successful COVID response meant allocated pandemic-related spending was not required in full. Some of those expenses, like ongoing investment in protection such as therapeutics and vaccines, will shift into the current fiscal year.
Question number 3 in the name of Nicola Willis.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Finance and asks, has he seen a report by ASB that soaring living costs are expected to add roughly $110 per week to household budgets over the next 12 months? If so, does he expect wages will keep up with that increase in the cost of living?
The Honourable Grant Robertson.
Mr Speaker, on answer to the first part of the question, yes, I have seen that report. In answer to the second part of the question, I note that it is the view of the authors of that report that, quote, households in general should have sufficient funds to pay the bills and potentially increase consumer spending, end quote. While that may turn out to be the case, I'm keenly aware of the situation of many households for whom that has not been the case. That's why the government has targeted support to those on lower and middle income earnings, while making sure that spending remains balanced and carefully targeted.
$1 billion more a week.
How are New Zealanders supposed to get ahead under Labour when for 18 months now inflation has crushed wage growth?
Mr Speaker, the member will be well aware that we have seen the quarterly employment survey annual median wages show that it's close to growth of 8%. It is a difficult time for many New Zealanders. That's why this government has stood beside them by making sure that we lower fuel excise duty, by halving the cost of public transport, by lifting the family tax credit, by making sure we increase childcare assistance, by lifting benefits and by lifting the minimum wage. Many of those things, Mr Speaker, the opposition has opposed.
Who is right? The Minister of Finance, who continues to claim Kiwis' wages are keeping up with prices, or the Parliamentary Library that confirms real wages fell 3.7% in the past year as calculated in the Real Wage Index?
Mr Speaker, it was not me that I was using as example there. It was, in fact, the Quarterly Employment Survey.
Can he confirm domestic, non-tradable inflation is now the highest since records began?
Mr Speaker, I can confirm that for non-tradable inflation. What the member consistently does, though, is insert the word domestic at the front of that. And I do note in today's release by Statistics New Zealand, they included the comment at the end of their description of non-tradable saying, however, the input materials of these goods and services can be influenced by foreign competition. As the Prime Minister's already indicated, if we take construction costs as one example of that, we can see up to 90% of that being caused by offshore things.
What is his explanation for New Zealand vegetable prices rocketing up 24% in the past 3 months alone, the largest quarterly rise since the series began?
Mr Speaker, a number of reasons for that, but if I can quote Sharon Zollner, the ANZ chief economist, quote, weather has been a big part of that, particularly in fruit and vegetables. We had an extremely wet July and August. This was similarly reinforced by Mills, the Countdown commercial director. Mr Speaker, that is an exceptionally large quarterly increase. New Zealanders will be feeling that. The member might like to think about her party's policies with respect to climate change. Actually, on this side of the House, we want to do something about the causes of those price rises.
What does he say to Deb, who writes, I couldn't afford to buy washing powder today. Clothes will be just washed in water. And how can the New Zealand public continue to have confidence in his economic management when he has failed to rein in the highest period of inflation in decades?
Mr Speaker, what I would say to that person is what I say to all New Zealanders, that this government has supported New Zealanders through the toughest times of COVID. We continue to support low and middle income New Zealanders through lifting main benefits, through lifting the family tax credit, through lifting the minimum wage, through supporting New Zealanders in everyday life. And that member's policy is to cut taxes for the highest income earners. Liz Truss has dropped it. It's time for that member to drop it.
Question number 4, Angie Warren-Clark.
Whakalofa lahi atu, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Housing and asks, what action has the government taken recently to address the housing infrastructure shortage?
Mr Speaker.
The Honourable Dr Megan Woods.
We have announced the second tranche of our Infrastructure Acceleration Fund for housing infrastructure projects. 192 million will fund critical infrastructure projects in our regional towns and cities, unlocking up to 11,500 new homes. These investments provide the critical infrastructure for new housing developments over the next 10 to 15 years, including public, affordable market and papakāinga housing, while also improving our climate resilience.
Gillian.
What infrastructure does this funding enable in the mighty Hutt Valley?
Mr Speaker, the River Lincoln Valley Floor Intensification Project will receive $98.9 million for major stormwater upgrades, including approximately 2 kilometres of new stormwater pipeline, pumping stations and outfalls. As part of a wider network response, Hutt City Council believes the infrastructure will unlock development and provide for capacity for around 3,500 new homes.
Supplementary. What other areas are set to benefit from the second announcement of the IAF Infrastructure Acceleration Fund?
Mr Speaker, 8 area projects were approved for funding for infrastructure in the second round of funding spread across the country. $36 million to support the intensification of Nelson's Central City. $24 million for Three Waters infrastructure in Lake Hawea. $18.5 million investment in Hastings will improve road access and resolve capacity constraints in the district's wastewater network. $5.7 million for transport and Three Water projects in Rangiora. $1.2 million in Motueka for stormwater upgrades and a new roundabout that will enable housing, and $1.9 million for an extension of Carson Street in the Whanganui suburb of Castle Cliff.
What is the average cost per dwelling for this tranche of IAF projects?
Mr Speaker, the amount of funding per dwelling ranges from $4,385 per dwelling in the Waimakariri district to $35,512 in Nelson City. And the average funding per dwelling is $16,744. The lesson here is that a government-determined cost per dwelling is not the right approach. Instead, a more nuanced approach that takes into account the specifics of the location and the project is required.
When will this IAF funding have an impact?
Mr Speaker, the IAF is a medium-term intervention that is funding core infrastructure works across the country that will enable housing. With funding agreements now signed, we will see physical works commence in the very near future. For example, New Plymouth will commence over the coming weeks and Omokoroa by the end of this year.
What feedback has she seen on tranche 2 of the IAF?
Mr Speaker, Nelson's outgoing Mayor Rachel Reese said that this was a game changer for Nelson. This grant funding is a massive financial saving to Nelson and will have a positive impact on our city centre for generations to come. In Hastings, Mayor Sandra Hazelhurst said the funding will help address the region's housing shortage. This investment unlocks further capability to address what is a long-term issue, and we are grateful for the government's ongoing commitment and partnership to enable our community to have a place to call home. And in the Hutt Valley, Mayor Campbell Barry has said the funding for the River Link is that this funder is a significant gain for the Lower Hutt, as it will enable us to undertake desperately needed infrastructure investment to support the building of new homes as part of River Link and on our valley floor.
Question number 5, David Seaman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister and reads as follows. Does she stand by all government's statements and actions?
The Right Honourable
Mr.
Prime
Speaker,
Minister.
yes.
Has she seen reports that KidsCan has had to expand the number of lunches provided to school children by 10,000 every day this year? And if so, how can she believe her government has been successful at reducing child poverty?
Mr Speaker, I don't have details on where KidsCan have expanded into, but what I can say is we have recognised the difference that healthy, free lunches can provide our lowest income families, which is why we are now delivering 1 million of those lunches per week into low decile schools across the country.
Supplementary. Does she accept her government's policies in the past 2 years have led to the highest inflation in 30 years, meaning parents are choosing between paying the rent and filling kids' lunchboxes, with charities like KidsCan filling the gap?
Mr Speaker, again, I challenge the member's assumption that it is the policies of the government that are creating what we are seeing as a global phenomenon. And Mr Speaker, I've already noted in answers previously in this House that we see inflation, for instance, in the OECD at 10.3%, the United Kingdom at 9.9%, the US at 8.2%, the euro at 9.1%, and interestingly, we're seeing rates rise across Asia as well. I doubt the member would claim that it's the New Zealand government's policies that are causing that.
Well, you might.
How does it help parents choosing between paying rent and feeding their kids to hear from their Prime Minister that other countries' governments have made the same mistakes as hers, and so they have a cost of living crisis too?
Mr Speaker, that is not my answer to families. My answer to families is the cost of living payment. My answer to families is a reduction in the cost of fuel at the pump. My answer to families is a halving of the public transport cost, an increase in the family tax credit, increases in the minimum wage, the Best Start payment, increases in benefit payments, making it free for under 14s to go to the doctor, and 1 million free lunches across low decile schools across the country, Mr. Speaker. That is my answer to families, because when we were elected as a government, we recognised child poverty was a problem. We wanted to address it, and we continue to do so. I note that member would scrap every initiative I just mentioned.
Supplementary. Does the Prime Minister stand by her statement earlier today that people's rents are going up due to the cost of building materials, or is a better explanation that her government increased expenditure from $87 billion to $151 billion in just 3 years, and the Reserve Bank printed $53 billion, leaving the economy awash with cash and inflation?
Mr. Speaker, the member asked me a question about non-tradables, and I gave her an answer around the contribution to the increases in cost in construction, and it's an answer I stand by. Another point I would make, Mr. Speaker, is that actually earlier this week we saw that in some parts of the country we're actually starting to see the increase in housing supply making a difference. We have seen in parts of the country where rents have started to come away, Mr. Speaker. We've got to keep building houses. Just this week we made further investments into the critical infrastructure needed to ensure that that will happen. That includes making sure we have the water infrastructure. That will enable another 11,500 houses to be built.
So, can the Prime Minister explain which of her statements she stands by? Do we have record home building pushing down rents, or are overseas factors such as building supplies pushing up rents? That's why we have high non-tradable inflation. Which one is it?
My answer, Mr. Speaker, was that building houses is non-tradable, but 90% of construction products used in New Zealand are imported.
Supplementary. In that case, is the Reserve Bank wrong when it says in its official policy on tradables and non-tradables that, quote, the non-tradables component shows how domestic demand and supply conditions are affecting consumer prices? And if so, does her government have any policy to tell Statistics New Zealand to stop mixing up tradables and non-tradables?
Mr. Speaker, again, 2 points that I would make here. Again, in the residential housing market, we see that for building, when we're relying, of course, on predominantly imported products, we are going to see those global factors having an impact. At the same time, Mr. Speaker, we have been concerned around the cost of building supplies in New Zealand. It's a reason why we saw an intervention from the Minister, and it's also why the Commerce Commission is looking into this issue. Ultimately, though, we need to keep residential building and construction going. And that's why, Mr. Speaker, we continue to invest in apprentices to make sure we have the ability to keep that construction going, infrastructure to make sure that we've got the pipes in place so that they can be built. And, Mr. Speaker, you're seeing that coming to fruition with consents at record numbers.
Question number 6, Tamati Coffey.
Mr. Speaker, whakalofalahi atu. My question is for the Minister for Small Business and asks, what announcements has he made to support mental health and well-being for small businesses?
The Honourable Stuart Nash.
Akum sa hom ni da I jang nim. Last Friday I announced that the government is extending its health and well-business support package First Steps across the country after being launched in Auckland last year. First Steps offers preventative support for business owners, managers and employees to reduce the number of those in crisis by providing a variety of tools, resources and perspectives.
Supplementary. Why is mental health and well-being support important to small businesses?
Mr. Speaker, we've heard from small business owners and employees that operating throughout a pandemic has resulted in increased feelings of stress and isolation, which has had significant negative health impacts on mental well-being. Our recovery not only relies on economic performance, equally important is the mental health and well-being of all Kiwis.
How many people will be supported by expanding First Steps?
Mr. Speaker, there are around 546,000 small businesses here in New Zealand and up to 1.2 million individuals who are owners or employees. Rolling out our First Steps package across the country will mean that they all get access to government-funded mental health and wellbeing tools to support them as they recover from the pandemic.
How many people have used the program so far?
Mr. Speaker, data indicates that over 70,000 users have interacted with the First Steps platform, with Auckland users downloading more than 75,000 resources. Experience shows that people did not necessarily want to have one-on-one consultation, but they did want to access resources that might help them.
What feedback has he seen from the program so far?
Mr Speaker, one business owner in Auckland who used the program said, and I quote, "It has given me more insight into myself, which is supportive of my ability to build my business in these challenging times," end quote. Another said the first steps, quote, "gave me the opportunity to de-stress and learn new skills," end quote. Finally, I leave you with the final words of one of our first step users, and I quote, "It's good to know that there are government bodies supporting us through such a tough time," end quote.
Supplementary, the Honourable Grant Roberts.
Can the Minister confirm that the First Steps program was jointly designed by the EMA, the Auckland Chamber of Commerce and the government? And can he further confirm the role of Michael Barnett in that work?
Mr Speaker, I can confirm that, and I would like to thank Michael Barnett, who will continue to have responsibility for rolling out this program. Mr Speaker, I think that First Steps should not only be confined to a post-pandemic world to only deal with the pandemic. I think this should be one of the business support programs that goes on in perpetuity, because the mental health and well-being of our small owners and operators is very important to the health and well-being of our general community and our economy.
Question number 7 in the name of Jan Logie.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Associate Minister for Workplace Relations and Safety and asks, has she seen the Human Rights Commission's Pacific Pay Gap Inquiry findings that in 2021 the pay gap for median hourly earnings of Pacific men compared to Pākehā men was 18.8%, and for Pacific women compared to Pākehā men was 25.1%? If so, what, if anything, is she doing to reduce the Pacific pay gap?
The Honourable Granta Ratakrishnan.
Mr Speaker, yes, I have seen the inquiry findings. I have also met with Saunoa Mali'i, Dr Karanina Sumeo, the EEO Commissioner, about those findings. And can I also just thank the Human Rights Commission and those who were involved in the Pacific Pay Gap inquiry for their work. This is important work. All pay gaps are unacceptable, and our government is committed to closing our gender and ethnic pay gaps. And that's why, for example, by the end of this year, government agencies will publish gender and ethnic pay gaps for the first time ever. This week also we are progressing legislation to establish fair pay agreements that are set to improve wages and conditions in sectors where Pacific people are overrepresented. Mr Speaker, we remain committed to using a range of tools to address gender and ethnic pay gaps, as we know that there is no silver bullet.
Supplementary. Does the Minister acknowledge that when the underpayment is so egregious and the majority of it can only be explained by discrimination and unconscious bias, there needs to be further urgent government intervention?
Mr Speaker, actually the report and the findings of the inquiry shows that there are a range of issues that feed into gender and ethnic pay gaps. Occupational segregation is one of them. Discrimination in the likes of the various issues that the member has raised are also part of them. As I've mentioned, there is work underway by the government to address these pay gaps. I will also include that various employment action plans deal with issues around diversity, inclusion and discrimination as well, with the view to end those pay gaps.
Is she aware that pay transparency legislation is the first recommendation of the report, and that a petition with over 8,500 signatures was received calling for pay transparency last week? And if so, why has the government not yet delivered on the commitment from last term to introduce pay transparency legislation?
Mr Speaker, I am aware of those, and we have begun work to investigate whether a full pay transparency regime in New Zealand would be beneficial, and if so, what that would look like so as to be effective in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and that is part of a range of other initiatives, as I've mentioned, that we are undertaking to reduce the pay gaps.
Supplementary.
When will the 50-year-old Equal Pay Act be updated to include racial inequities, considering the Polynesian Panthers have been advocating for equal pay for Pacific workers since the 1970s?
Mr Speaker, what I will say is that we have acknowledged the need for intersectionality in this piece of work. We have acknowledged that in our response to the Select Committee recommendations as well. And as I mentioned, there are a range of pieces of work underway to that end.
What does she say to businesswoman Lisa Tai, who has been on the Pacific Pay Gap Inquiry Advisory Board because she wants better for Pacific people, that her intelligent, hardworking, reliable mother got working 20 years on a minimum wage, suffering, enduring physical injuries as a result of the work?
Look, Mr. Speaker, firstly, as I mentioned, I thank everyone who was part of that inquiry for their work. I will also say that the aspirations of this government in terms of ensuring that Pacific people have better working conditions and better pay is absolutely one that we share with the person that he mentioned, and that's why we are undertaking a range of work on this side of the House, including raising the minimum wage to ensure that we meet those aspirations.
Supplementary. Will the Minister then commit to implementing the 6 recommendations for government in the Gender Pay Gap Inquiry to ensure Pacific people are paid fairly for their work and are safe and respected in the workplace?
As I said, Mr. Speaker, the government's committed to closing the gender and ethnic pay gaps, and we will investigate what the best way to do that is.
Question number 8 in the name of Maya Lubeck.
Whakalofa lahi atu, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Associate Minister of Education, School Operations, and asks, what report has she seen on delivery of the free healthy school lunches program?
Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Giantonetti.
995 of New Zealand's schools with 220,000 students receive a free healthy lunch each school day, thanks to the government's investment in the Ka Ora Ka Ako program. Evidence shows that as a result of this program, kids are experiencing better quality of life and learning outcomes, as well as physical, social and emotional functioning.
Supplementary, what other benefits has the program offered?
Research on the students who have accessed the program since its inception in 2020 is showing excellent progress in improving the nutrient intake of these kids by providing high-quality nutritional meals. We know that when kids are fed and healthy, they learn better.
Supplementary, what feedback has she heard from whānau and families?
Mr. Speaker, globally times are tough for many families, and New Zealand families are not immune. Knowing that their kids are getting a healthy lunch at school eases financial pressure for many families, especially those with multiple tamariki and many mouths to feed. It means that their kids can go to school regularly and thrive in a learning environment without barriers to education.
What other benefits has this program brought for New Zealanders?
At the beginning of 2022, 2,361 jobs had been created and retained as a result of the program. In addition to 153 lunch providers, we've engaged 13 iwi and hapu through a social procurement process. These iwi and hapu have partnered with 16 schools in Kura, from Te Tai Tokerau to Bluff, to deliver lunches.
Question number 9, Dr. Shane Reti.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the Minister of Health. What is his response to the independent report into the death of a woman who left the Middlemore Emergency Department, which stated that Middlemore had, quote, the worst ever compliance with the shortest days in ED health target for CMH during the month of June, unquote, and which other emergency departments, if any, also had their worst ever shortest days in emergency department in June 2022?
The Honourable Andrew Little.
Mr. Speaker, whakalofa lahi atu. Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the government, first of all, can I just offer my condolences again to the family who are at the centre of the events that were reported on in the report released yesterday. Mr. Speaker, at the time of the events that was the subject of the report, Middlemore Hospital was coping with larger than usual numbers of people in their emergency department because of COVID-19, because of the worst flu season in living memory, and because a lot of staff were away because of illness. As the report notes, staff were doing the best they could under the circumstances. I expect Te Whatu Ora, Health New Zealand, to take on board the lessons from the report, such as making sure people waiting in emergency departments have good information about what's happening and assessing anybody leaving without treatment. To the second part of the member's question, it's only been possible in the time available for Te Whatu Ora Health New Zealand to pull month-by-month data back to July 2017. From that data set, Auckland Hospital achieved 69.3% performance, and Whakatane Hospital achieved 84.6%. I would caution that June was the start of winter, and while it takes time for data to be processed, I would expect we will see that pressure on emergency departments was sustained throughout the winter months this year.
Supplementary. What is his response to Dr. John Bonning from the College of Emergency Medicine, who said that the ED wait time crisis was the worst he'd seen in his career, and that, quote, the graphs and the pictures of the amount of time people wait in emergency departments is quite stark. In 2015, we were performing really, really well, and it's just gone obviously to pot, and it is not some COVID blip.
Mr. Speaker, I note the comments by Dr. John Bonning, and I also note the comments in a 2019 International Journal of Health Policy and Management research report published about the targets as they were applied from 2009 under the previous government. It was an excoriating report about how those targets had been implemented, and it made this finding. It said that National's policy resulted in gaming behaviour in the form of clock stopping and decanting patients to short stay units or observation beds to avoid target breaches. The way the targets have been applied under this government and the measures have been applied have been consistent with what you would expect patient management to be, not being dodgy and manipulative like they were under the previous government.
Supplementary. Why then did the Labor government retire National's public health targets, including the target for shorter wait times in hospital emergency departments, when the New Zealand Medical Journal reported in 2017 that ED targets helped reduce ED deaths by 57% for an estimated saving of 700 lives in 1 year alone?
Mr. Speaker, sadly the members got it wrong yet again. The targets have not been retired.
Supplementary. What is his response to the Australian College for Emergency Medicine Chair, Dr. Kate Allen, who said that in her 15 years of working as an emergency specialist doctor, she had never seen it this bad, saying, quote, every emergency department doctor is worried that there will be more cases like the one in June because it is a reality of most emergency departments every day, unquote.
Mr. Speaker, I go back to my first answer. The reality is that this winter has been one of the most challenging and one of the hardest for the health profession that we have ever seen. We've not only had the ongoing prevalence of COVID-19, we've had the worst flu season that every clinician I speak to says they have ever known, and we've had elevated levels of staff absenteeism for perfectly explicable and justifiable reasons. The important thing is, Mr. Speaker, however, is that we know that we inherited a health system that was underfunded, that was poorly resourced. That's why we've increased resourcing by nearly 45%. We've funded an additional 5,000 nurse roles in our public health system, and we're now going through the very challenging process of recruiting into those roles in an international environment where the worldwide health workforce is about 2 million short.
Supplementary. Why did he just say that the government did not retire health targets when in written parliamentary question 14016 he wrote, quote, the previous health targets were retired in June 2021?
Mr. Speaker, the targets the member refers to are still measures that are applied, and ED departments around the country are measured against those that measure.
Question number 10, Brooke Van Velden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister and reads as follows. Does she stand by her statements on women's rights?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, yes. On the side of the House, we are committed to ensuring that there is every opportunity for women and girls to succeed. We have and continue to deliver on this commitment by making sure women and girls get the care they need by, for instance, extending ACC coverage to maternal birth injuries, rolling out free period products in all schools and decriminalising abortion. We boosted support for parents through extensions to paid parental leave, the launch of the Best Start payment and the reinstatement of the training incentive allowance. And we've taken action to address the gender pay gap by rolling out, of course, equal pay initiatives for female-dominated industries. I would add, Mr. Speaker, that internationally, our overseas aid and development programs have a specific emphasis on women and girls' economic empowerment, reproductive health and gender-based violence, as well as being strong advocates for the rights of women everywhere, especially in environments that we see right now as pertinent in Afghanistan and Iran.
Supplementary. Why did it take her almost 3 weeks to make the statement, quote, "I've been deeply concerned to see the loss of life and, of course, just generally what we would consider to be human rights issues as they relate to women and girls, in response to Kiwi women's recent concerns about women's rights in Iran?"
Mr. Speaker, the first time I was asked about what was happening on the ground in Iran was on the 27th of September. And of course, I gave my very clear view at that time, as did the Deputy Prime Minister and, of course, subsequently the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Mr. Speaker, I believe that possibly one of the reasons I was asked at that time rather than earlier may well have been that in that period, of course, we had the UN General Assembly.
Supplementary. Why did she need to be asked to make a statement before making one when it took her only 1 day to make a statement, quote, "Watching the removal of a woman's fundamental right to make decisions over their own body is incredibly upsetting in response to Kiwi women's concerns about women's rights in the United States of America."
Mr. Speaker, I utterly reject the assertion that I feel any less deeply about what is happening to women in Iran or indeed Afghanistan than I do, for instance, around the removal of any women's rights, for instance, as has been debated in the United States. Mr. Speaker, we have been raising the issue around women's rights in Iran, for instance, in the Human Rights Council in 2021. It has not just been in more recent times that we have raised those concerns. We called in specifically, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Bishop, if I may, we called specifically in the Iranian ambassador, called in the ambassador to share directly our deep concerns over what we were seeing happen in regards to the right to protest, but also in regards to the rights of women and girls in Iran, directly, Mr. Speaker. Of course, we stand alongside international counterparts in sharing our condemnation. We'll continue to do so. Unfortunately, the call-in of the ambassador was not widely reported, but I repeat it again in this House.
Supplementary. Does she believe that the statements she has made to date on the systematic violation of women's rights in Iran adequately reflect the outrage held by many women in New Zealand regarding the violation of women's rights in Iran?
Mr. Speaker, it's my job to reflect that outrage, and yes, I believe it has, not just by myself, but of course the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and for instance, we've also had comments from the likes of the Deputy Prime Minister. We will continue to raise those concerns, be it through international fora, directly with those representatives who are here. And, Mr. Speaker, not just the rights of women in Iran, but I again raise the rights of women in Afghanistan as well, who equally experience, for instance, Mr. Speaker, the view that the inability to express your religious attitudes freely being means by which to curtail women's rights, for instance, to enter into education. No woman in this country, I believe, would want to see a situation where, for instance, the girls are unable to attend education or access basic rights that we would consider fundamental in New Zealand, and we will continue to share that view.
When the Iranian ambassador was called in, who did they meet? Her, MFAT officials, or the Minister of Foreign Affairs?
Mr. Speaker, as is completely in keeping with our practice, it is of course right that the counterpart to the ambassador is within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. That is not unusual. Mr. Speaker, it's always kept at that level, and that is in keeping with international practice.
Supplementary. Will she answer the Iranian Women of New Zealand's call to strengthen her statement on women's rights in Iran by condemning the Iranian government and recalling the Iranian ambassador?
Mr. Speaker, at one point I think it's worth, I've shared that condemnation in this House, I've shared it in the media. I would have thought this House would actually be unified in the stance that's been taken by New Zealand. One important point to make on the recalling of, for instance, the ambassador in Tehran. They are accredited, for instance, to cover Pakistan and Afghanistan. Had we not had that assistance, our ability to bring out refugees and women who have needed the support and safe haven of New Zealand out of Afghanistan would have been curtailed. I think it just demonstrates the complexity of these situations. And I would note, for instance, New Zealand has played a role in ensuring that we've had high-level women athletes, we've had doctors, we've had judges, human rights advocates, and members of the LGBTI community resettled in New Zealand from Afghanistan. We take very seriously our role.
Question number 11, Todd Muller.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Agriculture and asks, does he support the government's proposed agricultural emissions plan, which reportedly could reduce production from sheep and beef farms by 20%? And does he agree with federated farmers that the policy will, and I quote, rip the guts out of small-town New Zealand?
The Honourable Damien O'Connor.
Mr. Speaker, Gum Sahum Nida I Jang Nim. Mr. Speaker, last week the government released our proposal for pricing agricultural emissions. This was effectively the recommendations made by He Waka Noa Partnership with some undecided issues to be consulted on. This includes how the levy will be set, governance arrangements, how farmers and growers will report and pay for emissions, and on what on-farm actions, including sequestration, will be recognised. Mr. Speaker, the member appears to be operating under the misconception that the government's proposed agricultural emissions proposal is drastically different from the partnership's proposal. In fact, the government has accepted nearly all of the recommendations made by the partnership, which includes federated farmers, and this is reflected in our proposal.
Supplementary. Does he stand by his statement when asked if there would be a loss in revenue for sheep and beef farming of 24%, which would mean $2.9 billion in lost export earnings, and I quote, well, that's a proposition put forward. I'm not okay with that loss, and I don't think it will happen, end of quote. And if so, what loss in export revenue is the Minister okay with?
Mr. Speaker, I'm not comfortable with any loss of revenue, but I have to say, Mr. Speaker, modelling is made on a large number of assumptions. In fact, there was a model put up that presumed and predicted that we would have 10% unemployment. That never eventuated. Mr. Speaker, I'm confident that New Zealand farmers can adapt to the challenges in front of them. Mr. Speaker, can I put to land use change that we've seen over the years? Quote, between 1990 and 2021, dairy land use increased 67% to 1.7 million hectares, assisted by irrigation and traditional sheep farming, areas of North Otago and Canterbury. Over the same period, other pastoral grassland, predominantly sheep, beef and deer, declined 36%, with large areas converted to forestry such as in Gisborne region, as well as urbanisation and reversion to conservation estate. Forestry and horticulture increased 40% and 49% respectively, while arable land reduced 25%. Mr. Speaker, we have seen through the decades much land use change in this country, and it's a hallmark and a credit to all the farmers in our country that they adapt to the challenges ahead of them, Mr. Speaker. And if I can just quote someone, Mr. Speaker.
No, I don't think
it is the preeminent...
That's enough.
It's a very valuable quote.
It might be, but you've addressed the question.
Supplementary. Well, to the Minister, well, does he stand behind his own government's report which says net revenue is going to be down 24%, or does he not? It's his report. Do you support it or not?
Mr. Speaker, there was two lots of modelling done in the report. One, in fact, the modelling put before it was done by He Waka Noa, the partnership group. The partnership group did the modelling that the member's referring to. Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to challenge the system that they used to develop that outcome, but I will say that I believe and I have confidence in the innovation of the farmers of this country. Can I say, though, regarding climate change, and because agriculture does form 48% of our total emissions, quote, It is the preeminent issue of our generation, without doubt, and it's the #1 issue around the world we have to deal with. That was said by Christopher Luxon on the 5th of December 2021.
Supplementary. Supplementary.
Toddler.
To the Minister, can he confirm officials advised the government that the fall in sheep and beef production under his government's agricultural emissions plan will increase global emissions? And how does shipping production and jobs to less carbon efficient farms overseas solve the climate change problem?
Mr. Speaker, can I say regarding displacement of emissions and transfer to other countries, there's no clear evidence that that will occur. The reality, Mr. Speaker, that New Zealand produces enough food for about 40 million people, Mr. Speaker. The reality is that many countries don't want our product. The only place that we will be able to sell our product into will be the high-value, discerning markets of the world where climate change is considered the #1 issue that we're facing, Mr. Speaker, and I stand by our government's commitment. The national government in 1997 committed agriculture to our emissions reduction plan. For 25 years, Mr. Speaker, we've been grappling with this issue. Many National Party ministers and members have come and gone in that 25 years. Mr. Speaker, I stand by our commitment to honour what we committed to in 1997 and to deliver a more sustainable future for the farmers of this country.
Supplementary.
Cameron.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is it fair that even at the low price modelled, that the tax will raise $220 million, but only $70 million is returned to farmers as incentive payments for lower emissions?
Mr. Speaker, the government is committed that any revenue raised through this system, and we've got to listen to consultation and feedback, and the government will report back at the end of this year. What we have committed to do is to recycle any revenue generated back into the agricultural sector. In fact, this government committed $380 million of taxpayers' money for research and development to assist agriculture to discover the techniques that will move us forward in this area. Mr. Speaker, that's a commitment from the taxpayer. On top of that, any revenue generated will all go back into agriculture.
Supplementary, the Honourable Stuart Nash.
To the Minister, does the Minister believe in the primary sector strategy of a move from volume to values? And does addressing the impacts of climate change represent our values and therefore increase the per unit price of our exports?
Mr. Speaker, I think that anyone who does a market survey of high-value products around the world will realise that the consumers who are purchasing for values. They want to know that the product, be they shoes or clothing or food, they want to know that the product is good for them and good for the planet. We will move from volume to values because that's the only place we can be as a nation with a sustainable future in food and fibre production.
Entry.
Todd Muller.
Supplementary to the Minister. Does he believe the proposed government response to E Waka e Hinoa complies with the Paris Agreement requirement that emissions reductions occur, and I quote, in a manner that does not threaten food production, end quote, when his own officials estimate it will reduce sheep and beef production by over 20%?
Mr. Speaker, I can read out again the land use change that we've seen across this nation for many, many years. Mr. Speaker, I know that we will continue to provide the world with fine quality food and that land will always be used for productive purposes, Mr. Speaker, in a way that maximises the value for the landowner and hopefully for future generations into the future.
The Honourable...
to the Minister, does he believe that floods and drought also threaten food production and reduce the net income of farmers.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, can I say that the member who asked the initial question was at a conference last week, Mr. Speaker, where one of the presenters there stated the fact that we have already seen a 20% drop in food production from climate change across the globe. If we do not address this issue and do everything we can to reduce global warming, Mr. Speaker, the farmers will be the ones who suffer the most.
Question number 12, Joe Luxton.
Mr. Speaker, thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Immigration. What recent announcements has he made about the next steps in the government's plan to reconnect New Zealanders to the world?
The Honourable Michael Wood.
Mr. Speaker, the government is focused on an immigration setting that works for New Zealand, which is why we have rebalanced our immigration settings, created streamlined pathways to residency for highly skilled migrants that didn't previously exist, and reopened our borders, welcoming thousands of skilled migrants to our shores in recent months in spite of global labour shortages. Last week I announced the next steps in our plans to reconnect New Zealand to the world and fill workplace shortages. Firstly, we are resuming the skilled migrant category with a streamlined settings and an interim reopening under the previous settings. We're also delivering on a 2020 manifesto commitment made by Labor to restart the parent category visa, increasing the number of visas granted each year and reducing income thresholds, which is very important in terms of ensuring that skilled migrants can settle well into New Zealand.
Supplementary. Why have these changes been made?
Mr. Speaker, the government is committed to listening to the voices of businesses, migrants and workers and ensuring that their views are reflected in our approach to immigration. We know there is a very challenging global labour shortage at the moment and that businesses are often finding it difficult to recruit internationally in a constrained global labour market. These announcements show that the government and the immigration system are responsive to domestic and international trends, while continuing to make sure that we deliver on our rebalance and ensure that our immigration system supports a high-wage, high-productivity economy and treats migrants with dignity and respect.
Supplementary. Why is restarting the parent category visa so important?
Well, Mr. Speaker, a key part of attracting migrants to New Zealand and ensuring the well-being of those who are here is making sure that they can have access to family and the support that they can offer. The parent visa category was closed in 2016 under the previous national government. Our government is not only reopening it, but modernising the settings by providing 2,500 places per year and additional options in order to be able to meet income thresholds. Resuming selections from this existing queue is a priority. I've certainly heard that from migrant communities, and I'm pleased to say that those selections will resume from the 14th of November this year.
Supplementary.
Supplementary, Erica Stanford.
Can the Minister explain why, under his new streamlined SMC policy, a new graduate with a PhD in, say, existential philosophy will be able to apply for a residence immediately when a nurse still has to wait 2 years to even apply for residence?
Mr. Speaker, our immigration settings operate across a range of different visa categories. The skilled migrant category is about, for the most part, attracting and supporting migrants to settle into New Zealand who might take between 5 to 6 years to attain the level of qualifications that are required in New Zealand. What is absolutely accurate to say is that under our settings across the skilled migrant category, across the green list category that the member refers to, and across Resident Visa 2021, this government is providing more and more streamlined ways for skilled migrants to settle in New Zealand than has ever been the case before.
Sorry, you've National had no more supplementary. Joe Luxton.
What feedback has he had on the changes?
Mr. Speaker, I've had very positive feedback on the changes that we have announced, including from the Restaurant Association of New Zealand. One of their members said, quote, because of this change, our business will be able to hire chefs who have been trained in some of the most prestigious kitchens in the world. Business New Zealand CEO Kirk Hope said, quote, the resumption of the SMC is good news for business, hoping to fill staff shortages in highly skilled areas. And Pranav Burla, who was quoted on News Hub, said of the parent category announcement, quote, when he spoke about his parents hearing the news, they were like, that's really good news to wake up to. They were stoked.
Supplementary.
Joe Lux.
How else has the government delivered on filling skills shortages?
Mr Speaker, data on the accredited employer job checks and work visa so far shows that INZ is making decisions more quickly than were being made for the previous essential skills visa in 2018 and 2019. Since it was rolled out in July of this year, the mean time frame for job checks in the AEWV is 17 weekdays, whereas the median decision time frame for essential skills visas in 2018 and 2019 was 20 workdays in 2018 and 21 workdays in 2019. More than 31,000 working holiday scheme applications have been approved since March, and thousands more working holiday makers are expected to arrive in the coming months. Mr Speaker, on this side of the House, making loud statements and waving hands loudly in the air doesn't cut it. We're actually getting on with practical measures to deal with these challenging global labour shortages.
Members, that concludes oral questions. I have received a letter from Brooke Van Velden seeking to debate Order 399, the findings of the independent inquiry into the death of a patient at Middlemore Hospital. This is a particular case of recent occurrence for which there is ministerial responsibility, public confidence in the health system and in the government's response to any problem with it is an important issue that warrants setting aside the normal business of the House to debate. Before I call Brooke Van Velden, I have also received a letter from Jan Logie seeking to debate the report of the Ombudsman on the murder of Malachi Sebeks. There can only be one urgent debate on a sitting day. However, I am willing to consider Ms Logie's application tomorrow if she wishes. I call Brooke Van Velden to move that the House take note of the matter of urgent public importance. Brooke Van Velden.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I move that the House take note of a matter of urgent public importance. Mr Speaker, every day New Zealanders engage with our healthcare system. Thousands of people actively seek help from other New Zealanders who go to work to help make people better. And we, most of the time, hope that other people can solve our problems because of the knowledge that they have and the care that they have for us. On very rare occasions, people go to the emergency departments and they need desperate help. They're really in their time of their most vulnerable point of their life, needing assistance from other people to help them get better. Now, in the case of this 50-year-old woman who went to Middlemore Hospital, she was turned away from the care that she needed because the hospital was under such pressure. And I'm sure there'll be many New Zealanders up and down our country who are wondering, could they possibly be put into the same situation as this poor woman who lost her life because she did not receive the care that she needed when she was at her most vulnerable. People often go to the emergency department, not even for themselves, but for their children or for their husbands and wives when they know that they are desperately needing somebody else and they have no idea what's gone wrong. We put our faith in the fact that we pay our taxes so that we have a public healthcare system that will look after us when we desperately need care. When we have children with broken limbs that need to be set immediately, we hope that the emergency department can be there for us. When we have something desperately wrong with our heads, in the case of hemorrhages going on or strokes, I know a lot of elderly in particular encounter the emergency departments in times when they've had a stroke. It's so vital that they get really good quality and very time-sensitive care to make sure that they can extend their lives and live a long, healthy life. We often encounter the healthcare system in a time of anxiety when we really do need care from other New Zealanders who get up every day and work hard to keep us safe and keep us healthy. But there is this poor case of a woman desperately needing help, and it wasn't received. And so on behalf of New Zealanders who have read this inquiry, or have heard about the inquiry into Middlemore Hospital and wonder if this will change anything or things will simply stay as the status quo. It's important that the government is held to account and is able to answer questions that New Zealanders will have about our healthcare system. Will this report into the Middlemore Hospital actually change anything? Will we see wait times decrease? Will we see the number of beds in our hospitals increase? Will people know that when they need to go to hospital, there will be workers who are able to answer their call for help? The issue here under this inquiry says that they found an overcrowded emergency department and a hospital well over the acceptable capacity. They found that only the hard work and dedication of Middlemore staff was keeping it from more serious incidents, and the environment is unsafe for both patients and staff, and it's not sustainable. Mr. Speaker, there are wonderful New Zealanders who work in our emergency departments. They are often stressed, they are often overworked, and it's because we have a healthcare crisis. We don't have enough people working in our emergency departments or across the entire healthcare sector to care for the number of people that are often looking for care. We need to know from the government what they are doing to make sure that there are adequate numbers of workers in our emergency departments, that people aren't overworked when they're needing to create diagnosis, and that in the future we can be guaranteed that there will be enough doctors and nurses and triage staff there to make the right decisions in a good amount of time, rather than making decisions based on the fact that they are overworked, overtired, and too stressed to make a good decision. We also need to know what the government will do to increase the number of bed capacity in our country. It's not just contained to Middlemore. We have this issue across our hospitals in the whole country. We had, when we were talking about the COVID response in particular, we had lockdowns because the Health Minister and the Prime Minister and everybody involved with the government told us we don't have enough beds to care for the number of people who are needing care during the COVID pandemic. Well, most of that is over, but we still don't have enough beds for the flu season. What is happening to make sure that on ongoing years we are going to have enough bed capacity for the people who need our emergency departments in any given day? We can't keep blaming it on COVID. We need to have an adequate response to what the acceptable level of care that a New Zealander can expect in their healthcare system is. We need to know that when a kid is really hurt and their parents are stressed and worried, and that they're taking them in a car or in an ambulance to hospital, that they can get the care that they need, and they can get a bed in a hospital that they need, and they're not going to have to wait overnight and then over days, or go back home to then come back the next day and be in a constant state of stress. We need to know that they can get the care as quick as humanly possible without overworking the staff that we currently have. Mr. Speaker, we rely on public confidence for our entire democratic institution. Every day people get up and work and pay our taxes because we know that we're contributing to the government taking our money and spending it on things that people know they can collectively contribute to. Things like the police, things like health, and making sure that we have an education system. I don't think New Zealanders would be happy to know that we're spending wastefully millions and millions and millions of dollars on projects that don't deliver any benefits for people, And yet at the same time, we have a healthcare system that is crippled. We have a healthcare system that can't give adequate care to people in their time of need. That's a basic role of this government, that people put our faith in our institutions, we collectively work together to become a community and pay our taxes so that we can help each other in our time of need. And that's not happening in this case. We have to do better. I think people would also ask the question of, what does this mean for our immigration settings? You know, we have a lot of people internationally who do work in the healthcare profession, and we know that they should and could come to New Zealand to help our overburdened healthcare workers. Why has the government not responded adequately to allow nurses, for example, on the fast track of the green list for residency? That is a barrier to helping to reduce the issues within our emergency departments. It's one simple point that the government could make, and one that we've been calling for in the ACT Party. We also need to know why the government hasn't been adequately addressing the need for more productivity and more economic growth so that people can become wealthier, over time pay more taxes, and over time that means that we can actually increase the amount that we spend in our healthcare system without overburdening everybody else's need for funding within the government departments. We know that we are not as wealthy as some of our OECD comparative countries, and that means that we can't spend as much on healthcare as other countries. It's a shame that we don't put enough emphasis on the need for economic growth and the benefits that this could provide to our entire economy, but importantly, how much we can spend on giving people valuable care in their time of need. We also need to train more doctors. What is this government doing to make sure that we're not just bringing in people from overseas to help with our workforce shortage, but we can train people here in New Zealand who want to be trained? We've had a cap on the number of doctors that we train every year for quite a while. Is the government seeking to increase this so that we can actually have more people in our emergency departments and more people who can help people in their time of need? Or does he believe that the number of doctors that we have currently being trained in our country is adequate? Because looking at this report saying that it's an overcrowded emergency department, hospitals are well over capacity, and it's unsafe and unsustainable, surely that means there is need for change, or is there? And I question the Minister about whether or not this government believes it's important to train more doctors. Do we need to train more nurses? Same question. Are we training enough people in this country who genuinely want to work in the nursing profession to give people care in their time of need? It's the same issue. We are just so overburdened and over capacity within our healthcare system, but there has to be a better way. I think that we need to acknowledge the tragedy that's occurred and make sure that this doesn't happen to somebody else. That if it was a preventable death, those deaths remain preventable. It is a tragedy to the family members and the friends of this woman who lost her life because she didn't get the care that she needed when she was desperately in need of it. And it's important that our healthcare system learns from this incident, that we don't just have a report and it goes into a filing cabinet somewhere and nobody ever reads it, nobody from the government departments reads it, nobody from the new Te Whatu order reads it. It's important that this loss of life doesn't go nowhere. There are New Zealanders who will be reading and hearing about this poor woman's case and wanting to know whether or not this will happen again in the future. Will they get the care that they need? Will their children get the care that they need? Will their family members and friends get the care that they need? Or would a preventable death not occur? Would it happen? It needs to remain preventable, if at all possible. I want to end by acknowledging once again this woman who lost her life. We're very sorry that that happened. And we share our condolences with her family and friends. And we hope that our healthcare system and the government can learn from this report. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Andrew Little.
Mr. Speaker, can I begin by once again acknowledging the family who are at the centre of this report and now at the centre of this debate. I acknowledge the grief that they have suffered through the loss of a loved family member. Can I also pay tribute to our health workforce, those working in Middlemore, but those working right across our public health system and who have had one of the most challenging 3 years, and then on top of that, one of the most challenging winters that we have seen or that our health system has experienced for many, many years. In fact, every clinician I talk to says of this winter flu season, it is the worst, they say, in living memory. And those were the circumstances in which Middlemore Hospital and the rest of our health system was operating in June this year, when this patient presented herself at about 1 o'clock one morning in June. It's interesting to note in the report that even the report author acknowledges his, and I think it is a his, limitations in preparing the report. He opens the report by saying, "I have not received or read any clinical notes. I have not reviewed any policies regarding the triage process or escalation procedures." So that is a matter for the independent reviewer. The independent reviewer is independent and is entitled to access to information. That's how the independent review process works. But this independent reviewer decided to write the report on the basis not of that clinical information, but on the basis of whatever information he had. And I say for the benefit of the member who has brought this urgency motion, to the report is also very clear, is that they thought that even had this patient been triaged in the way that they ought to have been, notwithstanding that the independent reviewer did not have access to triage policies, that it may not have prevented the outcome. And indeed, the reviewer goes on to say of this event that it was unfortunate, that it was unpredictable, and that it was unavoidable. And just as the hospital's own review of the incident concluded, is that it could not be concluded that were circumstances different in terms of the numbers of patients in ED and the number of patients in the hospital, that the outcome might have been any different. And I think it is important to note too, Mr. Speaker, that we can look at an isolated event, and this report deals with an isolated event, and it would be simplistic to draw conclusions without looking at the context. This is a health system that after 2 years of dealing with COVID, and its resources somewhat stretched to deal with COVID because you had nursing and other health staff redeployed to run the amazing vaccination program that vaccinated such a large proportion of our population. They're managing those turning up to hospital with COVID and the extra special care that they needed. And then we're faced with a winter with the borders open and a flu season unlike anything anybody had seen before. And those were the circumstances in which these events happened. They are not the only circumstances. And the reality is that ours is a health system that has been run down for years, underfunded and under-resourced. And the National Party, when they were in government, or at least when they're in opposition, still will not take responsibility for the appalling and disgraceful underinvestment and under-resourcing of the health system. You know, it's interesting how right now, this is a government that in 5 years has committed $7 billion for the upgrading and rebuild of hospital facilities that we desperately need. And you compare that to the nearly $1 billion that was put in the previous 9 years. You compare that to 2 years 2 years, 2015 and 2016, when no money was allocated to hospital facilities in this country. And so we are in a desperate catch-up mode. In addition to that, this is a government that has in its 5 years funded an additional 5,000 nurse positions in our hospital system because they desperately needed it. The previous Labor government committed to a safe staffing accord with the New Zealand Nurses Organisation that led to the Care Capacity Demand Management Program. And it was left to the previous national government to implement it. And by the time they ended their term 9 years later, it was in disarray. Most hospitals had not fully implemented it, in spite of having 9 years to do so. And one of the hospitals from my hometown, Taranaki Base Hospital, was one of the early starters, and by 2017 was one of the laggards in terms of implementation, because they were not interested in it. That's what happens when you have a party that just neglects health. A party that just neglects health. This is a government that has funded our health system to an extent that it has never been funded before. Increased funding by nearly 45%. Now, we know there are challenges in the rest of the health system too. Challenges in primary care, challenges in aged residential care. And we're working on all of those areas. So when the National Party complains about not enough doctors, they did nothing to increase the number of medical students. I'm very proud to have announced a couple of weeks ago a program for more medical graduates to train as GPs and to train in the GP context and to lift those numbers, and to do that in conjunction with or in collaboration with the Royal New Zealand College of General Practitioners. So these are the initiatives that are needed. And then we also know we're a system that has always been dependent on immigration, and that's why we have changed our immigration settings to make it easier for health workers to get here. Even during the time that our borders were closed, 5,000 health workers able to cross our border to be part of our health system. Many of them healthcare assistants working in aged residential care. But that's not the only place where we need to fill the gaps. We have a lot of gaps in the public health system as well. And we now have the accredited employer work visa. We've had, over 500 now applications of that. That follows on from the critical work visa, or critical work visa that had been in place during COVID and ended at the end of July. And I'm pleased to report to this House that since July, 381 nurses ready to work have crossed the border to come and work in our public health system. Most of them on the critical work visa, because that's what was available at the time, and a growing number now on the accredited employer work visa. And for those who think that, you change the immigration setting and the next day thousands of people turn up, that's not how it works. These are people who are applying for a visa that guarantees them residency, and so they are here for the long term. They are recommitting their lives and coming to New Zealand. And so it takes some time for them to close out their affairs where they are, shut down their lives and shift it all to New Zealand to start here. And that is what is happening. We have a lot of trained nurses coming here on visitors' visas, doing the competency assessment program, and then converting to one of the other visas. It will now be the accredited employer visa, and we're seeing that happening as well. Hundreds of nurses queuing up, getting their visas, getting their approval, and coming to work in our system. And that's what they're doing. And that's what they're doing. 381 crossed the border since July. That's what they are doing. And so I'm satisfied that Te Whatu Ora Health New Zealand is doing everything they can to recruit and to get nurses and other health workers here. And very shortly, they'll start up their dedicated immigration desk, have immigration officials, amongst others, working on it, and they will manage the process right from the recruitment ad that goes out overseas to dealing with the contact, dealing with the application, dealing with the visa application, helping them with their airfares and resettling to New Zealand to fill those gaps. But don't make that change quickly when you have 9 years of underinvestment, 9 years of running down the system, 2 years where you don't invest anything at all in the facilities in our health system. It takes a while to turn that around, and we are in major catch-up mode. But here's the interesting thing: when the ACT Party talks about we need more productivity, and all they talk about is doctors and nurses. Well, the reality is that healthcare is changing. And we saw during COVID, and we saw with the vaccination program, the brilliant effort that went in for a whole bunch of people who know about health care, who know about health work. And just with a little bit of micro-credentialing, a little bit of support and some good leadership, we're able to pick up tasks that previously we would have relied on nurses to do. And the challenge for the health system of the future is not for doctors and specialists to insist that they do everything, and not to have nurses doing a whole lot of tasks that other good, skillful healthcare workers can do, but to actually make sure we have a health system that is about the right health professional doing the right thing for the patient at the right time. That's the magic we have to achieve. And so much of the health workforce gets it, and they want it, and we are going to deliver it. And that's why there is a health workforce program of development underway at the moment. That's what has informed the initiatives that we've started implementing, the ones I announced on the 1st of August, the ones that I've announced since then. And very soon we will start a dialogue with the health workforce on what else it is that they want to see that's going to help us fill those vacancies, but most importantly, make sure that their working lives are as satisfying as they can be, that they are able to work at the top of their scope, exercise the skills that they've got. For those who want more qualifications and more training, provide them the opportunities to do that, and have a health workforce that is relevant to the needs of New Zealand today. One of the other incredible things is the Kaiawhina workforce that was stood up during COVID-19. Many of them so keen to continue to work in our health system. Some interests within the health system don't want them. I remember the words of Professor Des Gorman in a presentation he made earlier this year. There is privilege in our health system. There is privilege in our health system. And part of the challenge is to break that down and say, actually, we've got to distribute these important health tasks for skillful and qualified people. But most importantly, if we're going to make the difference, and have health services that are easily accessible to people who have not or who struggle to get access to health services, having the right people sitting in front of them, providing them comfort to be there and the skills then to address the health needs that they've got. That's the direction that we're in. That's the path that we're on. And I'm confident that Te Whatu Ora Health New Zealand and Te Aka Whai Ora Māori Health Authority is doing amazing work and will get us there. But I, again, conclude by paying tribute to the incredible health workforce that we have. A health workforce that is dealing with literally, in any one night, 7,000 to 7,500 patients staying overnight in our hospital system. Thousands more turning up to ED. You know, in June, at the peak of the COVID and the flu and the staff absenteeism, over 100,000 people, I said on radio this morning, 90,000, over 100,000 people turned up to a New Zealand ED in the month of June. Normally it's around 80,000, between sort of 70 and 80,000, over 100,000. That's the pressure that the system was under at a time when we are still trying to fill the vacancies, still trying to fill the gaps and working very hard to do so. But we were left in that position. Our health system has been left in that position because of those long periods of underinvestment. And it is important we rebuild our facilities and that there are EDs that are in desperate need of attention. You visit Hawke's Bay, you visit Hastings Hospital, and you see the ED there and the folks there tearing their hair out about the environment they have to work in. And we have to change that. But we've got hospitals, Whangarei Hospital, neglected for years but by the previous government. The MP at the time couldn't even persuade his colleagues to invest in upgrading the hospital. Fortunately, Whangarei has an MP who cares about people and their health care and has persuaded this government to make the investment. Now, I'm confident that Whangarei is going to have an outstanding, world-class hospital, thanks to the advocacy of the member for Whangarei, the member for Northland, the member for Te Tai Tokerau, great advocates for their people and their part of the country. And I pay tribute also to the member for Nelson as well, who has advocated strongly for the long overdue upgrade of the hospital in that region too. Even that, the former MP for that area was unable, and he sat around the cabinet table, to persuade his colleagues to invest in health services. This is a government that takes health seriously. This is a government that is investing in health to a level and an extent this country has not seen before. Not just in services, not just in the workforce, not just in the personnel, but in the buildings and the facilities as well. And we will continue to do that. And the great thing is we now have the ability to manage the system as a national system and to manage it on a regional basis. So hospitals within regions can make sure that where there is a need in one place and there's capacity in another place, they can support each other to deliver on that. And there's amazing coordination happening across the hospital network to make sure that that happens and to lift the performance of our health system. The independent reviewers report tells us we have more to do. We have change to make. And I'm confident that with the system that we have in place, with the leaders we now have in place and coming in place, with the dedication of the workforce that we've got, with the initiatives that we have underway, and principally those workforce initiatives, we will have that world-class health system that every New Zealand will be very proud of. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Dr. Shane Ritty.
On June 15 at 1 a.m, be in no doubt, Minister Little, that Middlemore ED was in crisis. The health sector is in crisis. I have said for some time that there are two parts of the sector that particularly worry me: aged residential care and emergency departments. And here it is, the chickens have come home to roost. This independent report is a damning indictment of Andrew Little's failure to address health workforce shortages, to heed ED warning signs, and to maintain health targets. What happened here? Well, the first thing that happened was there was overcapacity in ED. On the night involved, there were 46 patients for a room that sits 30 people. There were 94 people waiting for bed placement, a whole ward, presumably in corridors, waiting to get up to a hospital that was 98.2% full at capacity. The report tells us there was understaffing. There were 3 nursing vacancies, including the critical waiting room nurse, the nurse who triages patients, the nurse who says what the waiting time is, the nurse who coordinates those who are the most urgent. That was a vacancy, a critical vacancy. And do you think the reviewer had the privilege of a job description for that nurse? Not at all. Look at the report, not at all. There were warning signs. The weekly census report the week before, the independent reviewer said, showed the worst ED wait times to target, a week before, June the 15th. And on the fourth point I'll make is the outcomes. I will come and contest the point that the Minister has made that it was unavoidable and raise some challenges to that conclusion. How did we got here? We got here because the Minister refused to address the health workforce shortage that has been blazingly obvious for years. We got here because the Minister ignored warning signs. He was warned there was a health workforce crisis. Keriana Brooking, on behalf of all of the DHBs, when she was Chief Executive, wrote a letter in July last year saying, Minister, we have a health workforce shortage. And if we do not address immigration settings, several things will happen. And in the appendix, she even put graphs. She said, first of all, ED wait times are ballooning out. They will get worse. She said, planned care, our elective surgical lists, are ballooning out and they will affect New Zealanders for generations to come. And then almost her final sentence in that letter was that if immigration settings are not attended to, we will not avert our health crisis. Keriana Brooking, on behalf of every single DHB, warned the Minister in July last year there was a health crisis, that we needed to attend to health workforce, so we needed to use immigration settings to do that, and the Minister pretends he didn't even receive the letter. I don't think so. Ashley Bloomfield did, senior people, deputy DGs did, of course the Minister did, because I asked him parliamentary questions on it and he replied, of course he saw it, no one believes that. The Minister today said that he disputed the fact that he had retired ED targets. That is not tenable, as I quoted in the written parliamentary question, where he states that he has retired the ED targets. In fact, I'll go on for the whole sentence. What he says is, this is a written parliamentary question 14016, the previous health targets were retired in June 2021, and here's the next part that I didn't say in my supplementary, and public reporting of results was discontinued. He took down the public reporting of ED wait times. It wasn't until May or June, with consistent pestering by myself and colleagues on the health team, that he decided to put them back in public domain. He removed them from visibility because they were so bad, he wanted no one to see them. In his own words, the previous health targets were retired in June 2021 and public reporting of results was discontinued. He makes the claim that health indicators have taken them over, the 12 health indicators named in December last year. Do you see ED wait times in those health indicators? No. Most other sophisticated health systems recognise that ED wait times are a good snapshot of how the system is doing. It represents a primary care that is struggling, so they make ED their home. It represents a hospital system where the wards are full and you can't move them out of ED. It's an important measure, and the Minister refused to make it a health indicator or indeed to support the health targets that National set. To everyone in the health sector and at the ED interface, here is what the Minister told me in oral questions in the week of June that this tragedy happened. And so to John Bonning from the College of Emergency Medicine, who said the wait time crisis was the worst in his career, this is what Minister Little said. To Dr. Kate Allen, the chair of the Australian College for Emergency Medicine, here is what Minister Little said. To every single person working in the ED sector, here is what Minister Little said the week that this tragedy happened at Middlemore. What he said in parliamentary questions was, and the primary was around emergency department wait times, but as a whole, the system is coping. At the same time, in the same week that this independent report is making statements like, quote, ED overcapacity and an incredible 94 patients in ED awaiting bed placement, the Minister says the system was coping. Overcrowded ED, a hospital well over acceptable capacity and subsequent system dysfunction, the Minister says the system was coping. The reviewer says it was a desperate situation. That same week, the Minister said the system was coping. The independent reviewer said, this is an unsafe environment for both patients and staff and is not sustainable. And that very same week, the Minister said to this House, the system is coping. No, it has not been coping, Minister Little. No one believes that. Let's look at the time frame. If we look at ED wait times, let's see what we've got. The target is to wait less than 6 hours. 95% of people to wait less than 6 hours in an ED. 6 hours is a long time. With a child with a burst eardrum, with an inflamed knee that may be septic, with a spinal disc that's protruding on your sciatic nerve. 6 hours is a long time. But it was an international target that we all accepted. And what we know is that when we handed over target times in October 2017, that figure was around 91%. Today, it's around 78% is what the Minister is telling us. It has got worse every single year that the Labor government have had responsibility. If you think 6 hours is worse, what about 24 hours? Surely people can't be waiting 24 hours. Yes, they can. Minister Little wrote in parliamentary questions, hundreds of people are waiting 24 hours. But surely that's not the worst. Oh yes, if you ask Minister Little how many people are waiting in emergency departments for more than 48 hours, 2 days, would you believe there are dozens who wait more than 48 hours? You had the 12 ED specialists from Mid-Central, who I commend their bravery for putting this out in an open letter to the Minister a few months ago, saying, we have people with urgent, critical conditions waiting in wheelchairs for more than 8 hours. It was a brave statement from those 12 ED doctors. What we also know is that just like this unfortunate woman, people leave when the waiting time is too great. And what we know is every single month in New Zealand, and I know this because the Minister's written it to me, I can tell you exactly which hospitals are involved, 5,000 people per month leave. They leave before they're seen, they don't sign the indemnity form because they cannot wait any longer. The Minister said, oh, well, the report came up saying it was unavoidable. A few things we need to think about there, Minister, actually. What happened was that this person was a hypertensive. They hadn't been taking their losartan for about 2 years. When you have a brain bleed, maybe, if you check blood pressure, maybe, if it's high, you would restart their hypertensive. And maybe the outcome could have been different. And the neurologist raised this point as well. The Minister blames COVID. We've just heard a respected ED person saying this is no COVID blip. Oh, and by the way, I'm tired of that being a sad excuse for every bad behaviour from this government. Go back before COVID even arrived. Look at the ED wait times from October 2017 when we handed over to before COVID even arrived, and they were getting worse. The Minister's new excuse is flu. That does not stand up, and he's had to change his tone from being the worst ever in memory because it turns out ESR can't back that statement. This has not been the worst season ever, actually, when you look at the data. And when I inquire of him in ministerial questions, how does he substantiate that fact? He says, oh, of the people I've spoken to, they tell me it's the worst flu season in memory. Unbelievable. How can that be statistically significant or any sort of science whatsoever? Come up with another excuse, Minister, because they're tired and worn. New Zealanders don't believe you. You are responsible for this crisis. You are responsible for the health workforce shortage. You are responsible for removing targets. It's a sad indictment. It's a sad indictment. Be very clear, Minister. This is a crisis. Call it for what it is. Show the sector you understand them.
Dr. Elizabeth Kirikiri.
Kia ora, whakalofo lahi atu e te mangai me te whare. Ana te mea tuatahi mihi aroha ki te whānau pani I tēnei wā pauri. I mihi to the whānau friends and workmates of someone who's been lost in really, really awful circumstances. Being told that something is a preventable death, that if they'd been seen in time, things might have been different, but we can never know. Assurances that things might not have made a difference do not help, and just acknowledge the anger and the frustration and of course the grief of the whānau who are left to deal with this. Secondly, I acknowledge the staff at Middlemore Hospital. No one wanted this. We know that our ED staff especially, our healthcare workforce is so under pressure. And they're just really, really tired, really exhausted. Our health system wasn't doing great before COVID. It has exacerbated everything. And even though we don't have to wear masks all the time everywhere and mandates have been reduced, the impact of COVID will stay with us for a very, very long time. The fact that the report seems to suggest that they did their best because the patient was not declined care or was asked to leave seems to me to be a very, very low bar. I have been the auntie inside a waiting room and trying to keep a young person, a child, quiet while we're waiting to go to be seen. I've been a patient myself not that long ago, sitting in a queue of hospital beds waiting to be seen while people are crying, are hurt and suffering clearly around me. The Green Party has spoken out consistently through the Pai Ora Bill, through any of the health initiatives that are coming around, that we know that our health system is under massive, massive stress. That Pai Ora itself, we supported, is still a vision of what we would like our health system to be. And we are not anywhere near that. We would like to see that hospitals are resourced to provide the minimum care that they would expect of themselves, that there are enough staff to go around to meet the minimum requirements. But we also understand from the review and the situation that's happening across the country that actually a lot more has to be done to meet patient demand. We know that during COVID, we relied so heavily on our local communities, our iwi, our community Māori Pasifika providers to connect into communities, people that weren't necessarily using the health system, except in that final emergency. We support that more resourcing, more effort goes into making sure that people can be seen when something first happens, that they can go to their local GP without barriers of cost, transport access, that they can go to their local community providers because they're resourced to see them, that connections that have been made through marae and all those places can easily refer someone to a local place, so that the first time something major happens, it's not that they're turning up to an emergency department. And this is a short call, but we just want to see that no matter what your health condition is, no matter the symptoms that you're presenting with, that when you go into any part of our health system, you're treated with dignity, that what is going on for you is respected, it is investigated in a timely manner. No one goes to ED expecting to be seen immediately, but 6 hours is not an acceptable time. 5-4 is still not acceptable. But that people were treated with the care and dignity they deserve and with the appropriate level of urgency. We cannot tell by looking at someone what is going on for them. That is why we do all the tests. And so, finally again, to those whānau, to those healthcare workers, to the huge stress that everybody is under in our healthcare system, we need to see some urgent relief for you. There is no doubt that this will happen again if we don't. Kia ora.
Tangi Utukiri.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I rise to make a contribution to this urgent debate this afternoon. And following on from colleagues, can I firstly acknowledge the whānau, the loved ones of the person whose experience at Middlemore was far from ideal and certainly meant that they are no longer with us. Anyone in this House, I think, would reflect on opportunities and occasions like that, and it's appropriate to acknowledge the loss of life that's been sustained on this occasion. I want to also follow in the footsteps of colleagues in acknowledging the workers, certainly the workers at Middlemore Hospital in Auckland, but also those within our healthcare system generally for the outstanding work, the outstanding service that they provide on a daily basis, 24/7. Individuals who I'm sure we all in our own families have members of our community who we know who have over the last few years shown enormous strength when they get up in the morning or in the evening, depending on shift work, and make their way to work in order to serve and help others within the health system. Earlier, my colleague, Minister Little, talked about context, and I want to spend a little bit of time on that this afternoon because context is important in any situation, and in the context of this incident in June at 1 a.m. in the morning, it's clear that, you know, we all expect when we front up to a hospital, certainly to an ED department, that there will be policies in place, that there will be support that is given. And it is the role of a reviewer, in the words of the Minister, the independent reviewer, which I agree with, to make some decisions, to form some judgments, to have fulsome access to evidence and information, whether they be policies or other forms of record, to inform the report that they may write. I agree that there is a basic expectation in this country and indeed in this community, or my community, our community, that people should be able to access healthcare on a 24/7 basis. And particularly when it is of an urgent nature that the individual or their family thinks that they need to go to the ED department, to hospital, or whatever service is provided in local communities, whether they be urban, provincial or rural, to get the support that they need. But it's also worth noting that isolated events do occur from time to time, and so with that backdrop of context, that's particularly important. For the folk at Middlemore and elsewhere around the country, I don't think we need to look too far to see or to understand that we have experienced for quite some time a global pandemic, that we are in spring, but for many it still feels like winter. And that there are staff members in any workplace who are away sick. if we reflect on our own workplaces and our own communities or here at Parliament, we know the toll that COVID, that winter illnesses do take, and the sense of protection that people have in a workplace as well is also something that is quite important. But in terms of a hospital, I think there are, and I reflect on my own hospital in Palmerston North and the fantastic work that the folk there do. There are often additional layers of protection, particularly in circumstances where health is a significant issue, where there is additional resource at the front door, where there are limitations on the numbers of people that perhaps can be accompanying someone who's fronting up to a hospital. All of these things, all of these factors do point and paint a picture of context that I think is really, really important. After many years of underfunding, and Minister Little touched on this, much to the chagrin, I think, chagrin of those opposite, for the first time in decades, there has been a significant increase in uplift in the funding that government have put within the health sector. And I can tell members of this House, and I will tell others who wish to listen or ask, that also filters down into my own community of Palmerston North. When I think about the investment in Palmerston North Hospital, when I think about the Mapu suite that's been invested in, those that drive down Ruahine Street on a regular basis will see the work that is being undertaken, the first bit of kit and infrastructure that has been delivered in Palmerston North Hospital for many, many years. And I'm proud to be part of a Labor government that is investing in health, investing in infrastructure, investing in making a difference in terms of for people for whom it really makes a huge difference in their lives. I want to acknowledge, the COVID workforce, the individuals who tirelessly over many years have got up and gone about supporting our community. And, they don't ask for much, actually, because they want to support their loved ones, their own communities, in terms of whether it's in the face of COVID, through vaccination of workforces and loved ones. And I think of the efforts of those who have either retrained in order to deliver that service in our community, or those that are wanting to start out in that particular space. I think of those community organisations, our Māori Pacific community organisations, who are connected on the ground, also with new migrants, certainly in Palmerston North and other places as well, who are connected to be able to deliver those services. They have worked extremely hard in terms of painting a picture of context in Aotearoa New Zealand over the last 2.5 to 3 years. Now, we have made no secret around the fact that these changes are good and great, but they are not going to deliver wholesale changes overnight. Anyone who thought that come the 1st of July and the clock ticked over and suddenly it was no longer June and we were the 1st of July, that suddenly healthcare in New Zealand would be much, much better, is dreaming. We're on a journey. We're on a pathway to deliver an increase in improved healthcare for New Zealanders, and that is something that I'm extremely proud of. Just last week, I know many of us were out on recess and had an opportunity to spend some time with St John's, and this to me indicated the pressures that our healthcare system have been under for quite some time. And I was thankful that they were able to show me around their particular site. And in the process of that, the pager went off and the first responder and the emergency paramedic or technician were dispatched to a job. And then about 3 minutes later, a loud, audible siren started, and then the emergency care paramedic jumped in his vehicle and off he went. And then about 2 minutes later, another siren went off, and a visiting paramedic, who I think was actually from the Horowhenua, from Otaki, was visiting, and they were dispatched. And then I said to the person who was showing me around, what happens next? And he said, well, next will be me, and then after that, it's the manager. And I said to the manager, well, what sort of training do you have? And he said to me, I've got a basic level of medical training that will allow me basically to hold fort until the paramedics arrive. And so it's clear to me that even in Palmerston North, a provincial city that is in desperate need of increased funding that this government has delivered to meet the needs of my community, even in my city, there are pressures that are apparent. And they tell me that a lot of the calls are from people because they can't access a GP service. And I know that has been something that has been an issue for quite some time. But context is so important. Context is so important. Minister Little touched on the immigration changes that have been made. And yes, the 381 nurses that have been ready since July, and the changes in terms of the specialised unit that will effectively have a real focus on the way in which those applications are processed and considered. And that will no doubt make a difference. But when Minister Little talks about the month of June here in New Zealand and over 100,000 people turning up to an ED department here in New Zealand, that indicates a huge level of pressure. Actually, 80,000 just in a general month on itself and on its own indicates a huge sense of pressure as well. So these wholesale changes, Madam Speaker, are coming, but they're also a result of professionals within the sector who are working extremely hard to support patients, to support whānau, to support others in their time of need. I agree with Brooke Van Velden when she says that we pay taxes for a public healthcare system and it's about the best use of resource. Well, I reflect again on the largest investment of a government in recent times. And it's come from a Labour government because we have acknowledged that the system is broke and it needs to be fixed. Now, that's not going to be a small comfort for the woman and her experience at Middlemore, but it is some comfort for others. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Speaker.
I call on Matt Ducey.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And that last member who's resumed his seat should hang his head in shame. As the chair of the Health Select Committee, here we are in an urgent debate, debating a report of a New Zealander who died because they could not get access to timely health care, and all he was intent on is trotting out the Labour Party talking points, the Labour Party lines. Let's go to the report. Let's go directly to it, which says it is important to note that at no stage was the patient at fault here. The overloaded and under pressure health system failed her. This is New Zealanders' every worst nightmare, that one of their loved ones is going to go to the emergency department in a time of need and not find the access to the care that they need. The report says an overloaded and under pressure health system failed her. But listen to all the Labour callers today, and all you hear is the good things they're doing in the health system. Well, that might be true. I suppose that is the role of a government, to do some good things. But don't gloss over the huge cracks that are out in health system today. And I challenge the many New Zealanders listening to this urgent debate today, go back and listen and watch the call of Andrew Little, the Health Minister, and then compare it to Dr. Shane Reti, the opposition health spokesperson. And I say to New Zealanders, who do you want as your next health minister? A doctor or an angry trade unionist? He was warned. His reforms that he pushed through in the middle of a pandemic would undermine the health system, and that's what they've done. Their own Heather Simpson report said to reduce 20 DHBs down to 8 to 12. And what do? 20 to 0 in the middle of a pandemic. And they got the gall to call into question the last national government. Well, under the last national government, when you look at the 6-hour waiting time target, 91% of New Zealanders were getting through ED in 6 hours. That was in 2017. 5 years later, New Zealanders only 78%. 78%. And that's what we're seeing under this government, that will come up to their 5-year anniversary in the next few weeks. 5 years of failure. And what they did is they repealed those health targets that incentivised and drove the right behaviour. How can you defend a reduction from 91% of New Zealanders who pitched up to ED getting seen in 6 hours? Now we only have 78%. On top of that, as Dr. Shane Reti has revealed today, 5,000 New Zealanders a month are just walking away from the ED, not even being seen. And you know what? When you look at the evidence and the research behind that health target, the evidence showed that target saved 700 lives a year. 700 lives. And this government came in and scrapped that target. Because let's remember, Ms A is the name they've given in the report of this lady who sadly passed away when she didn't get access to the timely care she needed. She turned up to the emergency department. The report says there was only 30 seats in that ED. There was 46 people already in there. A huge over-occupancy. There was 3 nurses down that morning, 10% vacancy. And basically what they were saying to New Zealanders who were turning up in that emergency department that morning, the wait time was some hours. That's what it was, some hours. And as Dr. Shane Reti rightly pointed out in the report, is that this was highlighted a week before as the pressure grew on this emergency department. And what we know about emergency departments is that they are a barometer for that health system. That is the access point that people need for that acute care. And what we know in New Zealand today is sadly, thanks to this government, because I tell you what's propping up the health system at the moment is hard-working Kiwis in the health workforce. But slowly, under this Labour government, we are seeing our health system turn into a second world health system because of 5 years of mismanagement from this government. We desperately need more health workforce in New Zealand. We can't sustain this level of vacancies and the reduced access to vital health care. We need to retain our health workforce. We need to ensure we're working with them because, of course, if we've got our health workforce having to cover vacant roles and they're already stretched, we're just burning them out. We need to train more of our health professionals. And I'm sure the callers from Labour will get up and say what they're going to do in the future. Well, that's fine, but you've had 5 years. What have you done? Why have we got skyrocketing vacancies in our health workforce? And what's galling is just the ideological position this government's taken around skilled migrants. New Zealand is a popular destination for an international health workforce, but you've got to be more than popular. You've got to be competitive, and we're not competitive. Canada, Australia, they're all cutting our lunch at the moment. And that workforce who would like to come and live in New Zealand, they're getting attracted with better entitlements in other countries. And we're just not there because this Labour government ideologically refuses to accept that part of the solution, yes, let's retain our workforce, let's train our locals, but we need to attract skilled migrants. And that's what we're not doing at the moment. And it's hugely concerning when we look at our health system that is under so much pressure. And we see that in our reports. The report we're debating today says research has repeatedly shown that ED overcrowding leads to increased morbidity and increased mortality. Of note, ED overcrowding leads to an increase in patients not waiting for assessment and or treatment. And that's what exactly happened in this case when you read the report. A person turned up to an overstretched ED department where the warnings had been there the week before in their reports, but they had no ability to respond. And a New Zealander turned up in the early hours of the morning and left because she couldn't get the care she needed. The person who wrote the report goes on to say, "The evidence provided to me strongly reflects an overcrowded ED, a hospital well over acceptable capacity and subsequent system dysfunction. I strongly suspect that it is only through the exceptional hard work and dedication from staff that there are not many more serious incidents occurring that affects patient safety. This is an unsafe environment for both patients and staff and is not sustainable." So what New Zealanders want is a health minister who's going to take some responsibility, is going to take some accountability, to show some leadership and accept the crisis that we are in today. There is an ability to respond quickly if this government accepts the position we're in. But when you listen to the government callers today in this urgent debate, there's denial, there's head in the sand, there's great hyperbole about what they've done. Well, if it's that good, why are the numbers of New Zealanders who get seen in 6 hours dramatically reduced under this Labour government?
I call on Dr Tracy McLellan.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I start my contribution to this urgent debate, as many of my colleagues have already done, by sincerely acknowledging the life lost, the person whose death has been the impetus of the report that we are now debating in this House this afternoon. And I extend my condolences to the family and to all loved ones involved. As several colleagues have also mentioned, I think it's important in times like this, when the health workforce will be the ones most acutely feeling this incident in terms of their response, to acknowledge that we do have a world-class health workforce, and it's an incredibly potentially easy to lose sight of that at the moment whilst we talk about all of the stresses that the health system undoubtedly is under. And it's easy to lose sight of the fact that we have an amazing world-class health workforce, and as a government it is up to us to support them and to fund them and to ensure that they're able to work the way that they do. Madam Speaker, before entering this House, I did a variety of things, but the role that I performed most recently before being elected to this House was that I worked for the New Zealand Nurses Organisation. And as someone who worked for the New Zealand Nurses Organisation, I had, I believe, a relatively broad view of what our health system looked like. Certainly across the main sectors of the primary health care, the DHB health care, the aged care sector, and our private hospitals and hospices. And Madam Chair, I do agree somewhat with the member who's resumed his seat insofar as acknowledging that we do need more people working in our health force, and we have done for a number of years. We certainly needed more people several years ago when I was working in this sector. And I also, Madam Speaker, want to acknowledge that every day I was privileged to work with amazing nurses and healthcare assistants who were incredibly dedicated, and I acknowledge all of the delegates in particular who took on those extra roles to advocate on behalf of their colleagues, and many of whom back in 2000 13, 14, 15 were already tired of having to advocate for shortages in the healthcare sector. And as others have acknowledged, you can't magic up a nurse overnight. These people are highly trained, and it takes time to address those shortages, let alone the shortages with physicians and various other medical people in the healthcare sector, I should say. Madam Speaker, two things when I think back about that time at NZHRL come to mind. And the first one, in relation to comments that were made earlier by members of the opposition, was about CCDM, the Care Capacity Demand Management System that has been funded quite some time, conceived of by the opposition, but never funded appropriately. Personally, I worked on the implementation of that in one small hospital for 5 years. And do you think we could get to the bottom of it? No, because it was never funded enough. And just as perfect policy may exist, and there's plenty of examples of really good examples of that, they will always fail if they're not funded appropriately. And I am still rueful of the opportunities that the previous government overlooked in terms of getting this system off the ground properly, and what a difference that would have made to our current workforce today. The other thing that strikes me, Madam Speaker, is I also worked on aspects of high performance, high engagement. And the thing that I will always think about our workforce is just how incredibly clever they are. There's some amazing skills out there. And if we were to resource them properly and to afford them the clinical the clinical freedoms to do things differently, again, we can build a better health system. But what I am particularly proud of is the fact that this government has been the one to acknowledge that things do need to be done differently. We have made record investments in building a new system. It won't happen overnight, but we are absolutely moving in the right direction. Nearly 45% increase in funding, which has equated to 5,000 new RNs, and that's just one aspect of the workforce. The independent review undoubtedly has brought up some useful recommendations, and we thank all those people involved with that as well.
I call on Erica Stanford.
Madam Speaker, well, this today is a call that I'd rather not have to be taking. This shouldn't be happening in New Zealand today. A woman with severe headaches told she would have to wait 8 hours at Middlemore's emergency department, left because of that wait time in extreme pain, and tragically passed away from a brain bleed. What we do know, Madam Speaker, is that on that day Middlemore was short-staffed. They were 3 nurses down, and importantly 1 emergency department nurse. What is important to note, Madam Speaker, though, is it wasn't only on this day, and it wasn't only at this hospital. This was happening around New Zealand, and we know that because around the same time, in fact, I think in the same month, Wellington Regional Hospital issued a provisional improvement notice because they were so dangerously short-staffed and closed down 3 wards. This is happening across New Zealand and continues to happen. A report stated that it was only because of the hard work and the dedication of their staff at Middlemore that was keeping it from experiencing more severe incidents. What we do know is that these exceptional health professionals, these heroic nurses, are doing everything they can. They're working long hours, they're working double shifts, but they are burned out. They're stressed out, they're overworked, they're up against it, and we know that they're leaving. They don't want to, but they have to. And we are not attracting enough nurses in New Zealand to cover the ones that are leaving. They're leaving because they're stressed out, and they left this year, last year and the year before, because of the appalling way they were treated by this government, despite what they have said today. Let's not forget the split migrant family nurses who left because they were split from their families, and it wasn't until we kicked up a stink that they actually, only in May last year, allowed them to be reunited with their families. Resident 2021 last year missed out a bunch of nurses because they were on the wrong visa type or because they were students. They left. Nurses with offshore partners were sent back to their home countries to sit there for 3 months, and this was happening in June last year, or June this year, sorry, I should say. This was happening in June this year, being sent back overseas to ridiculously spend 3 months with their partner before they could come back into New Zealand with that partner. That's how this government treated nurses, and that's why they left. And now we have the green list debacle, where we are not able to compete with Australia. So when we know that Middlemore was 3 nurses short-staffed and 1 ED short-staffed that night, we should look into the dismal treatment of nurses by this government who make them choose to leave and have chosen to leave over the last 3 years. Until we have better immigration settings, this will continue to happen. The nurses' organisation say that it is their #1 concern of their members about staff shortages. We should be doing everything we possibly can to get more nurses fast-tracked into this country. No one agrees with a 2-year work to residence for nurses. Not Health New Zealand, not the Aged Care Association, not the nurses' organisation, not the care and community sector. The only people that believe in this policy is the government. No one backs them. And on the back of this damning report, what we would have expected today is immigration policy settings to immediately change, to get more nurses in. That's what we expected. But what did we hear today? What did we hear? We heard excuses. That's right, Dr. Shane Reti. COVID. Oh, it's a really bad flu situation. It takes time for change to bed in. And the most egregious excuse we heard today from Minister Little, well, the likelihood is she may have died anyway. That's what we heard today from this minister, when we should have been hearing what I am going to do today from this health minister and the immigration minister is getting more nurses into New Zealand by fast-tracking them, by being competitive with Australia. We do not need more excuses, we need solutions. That's what the public of New Zealand expect. What we want to see, Madam Speaker, to avoid this happening again, is nurses on the green list. Now, despite what they say about the hundreds of nurses coming in, only 97 have applied in 3 months. That's worse than when the borders were closed. The cap course nurses, they still can't bring their families when they come in. Let them do that. Why are we so hung up with a nurse having to have a job offer, for goodness sake? Let us compete with Australia. Let us have the same settings for nurses so that they choose to come here. Or are Labor too arrogant to admit they got this wrong, these immigration settings wrong? In the face of this tragic death, will they finally listen? Will they set aside their pride? And will they make us a more attractive destination for nurses? Will they stop the excuses and finally give us workable solutions?
I call on Dr. Liz Craig.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd just like to start my contribution with passing on my sincere condolences to the family of the woman who's led to the report that we're debating today. And I'd also like to acknowledge the incredible work that those working in the emergency department do. The doctors and nurses who get up every day, who turn up day after day to make that difference in other people's lives. I've spent a few years back early in my career working in emergency departments, and I think it's really important that, you know, as health professionals, you go there, you sit down, each patient you're speaking with, looking after, is different. You spend a lot of time trying to sit down and understand where they're at and how you can provide the best of care. And it's a really important role that our doctors, nurses and other health professionals do. And also for whānau. I spent a lot of time when my mum had leukemia sitting in emergency departments, and just the care and respect that they were given, you know, with mum and also later with dad when he had his stroke. It's a wonderful career, it's very rewarding, but it also can be incredibly demanding, particularly at very busy times of the year. And I think when events like what we're debating today happen within the health system, it's important that we sit down and we undertake a review to try and understand what happened, what were those circumstances that led to this event. And I think when I first started out in medicine, there was a real framing, and we were, as you know, junior doctors, quite anxious, because often the framing back then was it was an individual doctor's fault. But then as things have progressed, there's a much better understanding that actually many things that happen have got the underpinning circumstances, and trying to understand the context in which these events occur. And I'd like to just acknowledge those that undertook this review and the report that we're debating today. And basically I expect that Te Whatu Ora will be considering the findings in detail and also taking on board the lessons from the report. But I also want to just talk a little bit about that broader context and thinking about the context in which our emergency departments have been operating over the last 2 years, but also during the period when this event occurred. And I think, having worked again in child health during winter peaks, every year we do see winter peaks in acute respiratory infections, and emergency departments are very busy. But I think this year was particularly exceptional. We had the opening of the borders after 2 years of closure and very, very low, up until that point, rates of influenza in the community. And so what we were grappling with this winter was one of the largest outbreaks of influenza and the impact that that had on our emergency departments and also on our hospitals in terms of inpatient care. But simultaneously, we were grappling with COVID. And the Omicron surge we experienced not only meant that we got extra demand, people coming into hospital, but it also meant that our health workforce, many of them were off sick. We were dealing with staff absences at the same time as incredible peaks. And it was just interesting there, just wanting to acknowledge, again, the staff and the role they played. When we were doing our annual reviews in the Health Committee, a number of the DHBs were talking about how they realigned their teams and basically managed through those peak times, and just acknowledging the efforts that went in there. But I think while we're talking about the exceptional circumstances, I think we've got to acknowledge that this situation didn't arise overnight. It also comes on the back of many, many years, or if not decades, of underinvestment in our health sector. And I think, again, just thinking through my previous role monitoring child health before I came into Parliament, one of the things that we used to monitor was called ambulatory sensitive hospital admissions. That was hospital admissions which could be prevented by better access to primary care. And every winter we see, huge winter peaks in these conditions. And I think a lot of the thing about how we manage our emergency departments is not just making sure that they're staffed well, but it's making sure that primary care, our GP services are available, because many of the people that are presenting to primary care, to emergency departments, could have been managed in primary care. And so when we first came into government, one of the issues and one of the big barriers that we were seeing was people couldn't afford to go to the doctor. And that's where we put in place the low-cost visits to doctors with community service card holders. So now, instead of people having to pay $40, $60, they're paying a low fee. Back then, I think it was under $20 for a visit. And I think that has meant that many more people can access primary care. But I think one of the other things working in emergency department, and often one of the groups of patients who often need the most time for us as health professionals, is those presenting with mental health issues. And so again, what we've been doing more recently is putting in place things like the Access and Choice program in primary care. So basically people can turn up and see a health practitioner, a health coach, and start to grapple with some of those issues around mental health and addictions. And so again, thinking through how we can see people in primary care, make sure they get the best care they need without having to go to emergency department. But looking ahead, since coming into government, what we have got is a largest number of nurses and doctors working in the health sector that we have had. But I think for many years, but basically, we think that there's more work to be done. We're in a situation where internationally there's huge workforce shortages, but we've got to make sure that as a country we can provide the workforce that we need. And I think that's where there's been a lot of focus more recently. So basically government looking at the number of GPs and working with the Royal New Zealand College of General Practitioners to increase the number of GPs trained from 200 to 300 each year. But also it's quite apparent that nurse practitioners, again in primary care, can manage a significant amount of the health demand that's coming in the door. And so again, basically doubling the number of trained nurse practitioners from 50 to 100 each year. So we've got our own workforce that's coming through the system. But also nurses who may have left the workforce for whatever reason, and then thinking of those barriers for them coming back in. So again, providing support and extra funding up to $5,000 to help nurses coming back into the system with their registration costs. We also are, though, competing in an international market. And I think this is where, with the health reforms, it's actually potentially will make a significant difference, because up until now, thinking through each DHB trying to recruit their own health workers, but now within Te Whatuora creating that one-stop shop where we can not only recruit health workforce, bring people into New Zealand, but also assist with a lot of the issues around getting registration for those who are qualified overseas. So the competency assessment programs and things for nurses coming in to make sure that their qualifications are recognised here, but also some of the time that's taken when you've got somebody that's got a medical qualification that then has to spend time here in New Zealand getting that registration acknowledged. So again, financial resource and other support so that our health workers, as we recruit them from overseas, not only can come and find a job, be assisted with the processes of immigration, but actually make sure that their qualifications apply here. And so there's a lot of things that we are doing to improve the health system. And I'm optimistic that as we move forward with the health reforms that we've put in place, we can be making a real difference, not only in the development of our workforce, but also thinking about how we can manage so that people can basically get to primary care and actually receive the care that they want. Because I think a lot of the rationale for the health reforms was the inequities that we were seeing, was about the fact that we had the postcode lottery. It's about the fact that if you turn up to an emergency department or try and get a GP, it's very, very different in one part of the country to the other. And so I think what we're doing now is grappling with many issues that have been going on for several decades, and it will take time to do that. But as a government, we're absolutely committed to reducing those health inequities and to making sure that people, when they turn up, whether it be to the GP to get the care they need, whether they've got some concerns with their mental health, they can turn up to a health improvement practitioner and have that conversation. Whether it be to turn up to A&E, again, that they'll get the care that they need. This is an important issue, and just coming back to acknowledging the family and the woman that led to the report that we're debating today, and our government committed to improving our health system, our workforce, and making sure people can access the care they need when they need it. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Whakalawhalahi atu. The time for this debate has expired. I call on Government Order of the Day number 1.
Fair Pay Agreements Bill, second reading.
Madam Speaker.
I call on the Minister, the Honourable Michael Wood.
I present a legislative statement on the Fair Pay Agreements Bill.
That legislative statement is published under the authority of the House and can be found on the Parliament website.
I move that the Fair Pay Agreements Bill be now read a second time. Madam Speaker, it is most appropriate that this piece of legislation is continuing its passage through the House this week, because tomorrow is Thank Your Cleaner Day, a day in which we are called upon to recognise and remember the essential work of cleaners right across our society here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and right around the world. And cleaners, Madam Speaker, are actually often not seen. I'm very conscious of the fact that in office blocks and factories, and indeed in these halls of Parliament, it is often after we have finished our work, left for the night and gone home, that cleaners